Chapter 7. 3 days later, one of Demetrius Libanus's runners brought Joseph a letter in which the actor curtly and dryly requested him to hold himself in readiness to wait upon the Empress with him at 10 o'clock on the day after next. The Empress. Joseph's heart stopped. Her bust stood everywhere in the streets and was worshipped as divine. What should he say to her? How was he to find words that would pierce to the heart of this strange woman, whose life and thoughts were raised so high above those of other human beings? While he was asking himself this, he already knew that he would find the right words, for she was a woman, and he had a faint contempt for all women, and simply because of that, he knew he would win her favor. He read over his manuscript. He read it aloud with sweeping gestures, as he would have read it in Jerusalem. He had written it in Aramaic. Now, laboriously, he translated it into Greek. His Greek was sprinkled with vulgarisms and errors. He knew that quite well. Wouldn't it be unwise to appear before the Empress with a badly prepared manuscript full of errors? Or might not his very errors seem to her naive and appealing? In the interval of waiting, he avoided talking to people. He wandered about the streets. He turned the other way when he saw an acquaintance, rushed to the barber, bought himself a new perfume, and fell out of the most absolute confidence into the deepest dejection. The Empress's bust showed a head with a low, clear, and delicate brow, long eyes, and a mouth which was on the large side. Even her enemies admitted that she was beautiful, and said that on first seeing her everyone was dazzled. How would he, a petty provincial, be able to stand up to her? He must find somebody with whom he could talk the whole matter over. He ran back to his lodgings and unburdened his heart to the girl Irene. Imposing strict secrecy on the radiant, highly flattered girl, he told her that he had something very important to divulge, and then everything came out with a rush. He described how he thought his interview with the Empress would go off, and repeated what he would say to her. He rehearsed his speech before Irene, and tried over the words and the gestures. Next day, in his best clothes, he was borne in the splendid litter of Demetrius Libanus to the Imperial palace. Couriers ran in front, and a great train followed. When the litter passed, the crowd remained standing and cheered the actor. Joseph gazed at the Empress's busts in the streets. Some were of white marble, some were painted. Amber yellow hair, a pale delicate face, red lips. Poppaea, he thought. Poppaea meant a doll. Poppaea meant a baby. He thought of the Hebrew word, Jildi or Yaniki. He had himself been called that once. It could not be such a very great ordeal to face the Empress. From the descriptions which he had heard of her, Joseph expected to find her dressed in exquisite robes and reclining on sumptuous cushions in the fashion of Oriental princesses, surrounded by attendants fanning her, and by female slaves bearing perfumes. Instead, he found her sitting quite at ease on a comfortable chair. She was very simply dressed, almost like a matron, in a long stola. It was true that the stola consisted of a stuff which had scandalous reputation in Judea. It was made of Cohen silk, thin as a web. She was not heavily rouged, and her hair was merely parted in the middle and tied in a knot at the back of her head. No hint of the piled-up coiffure interwoven with jewels which was usually seen on the heads of ladies of the ruling class. The Empress sat on her chair like a pretty young girl, and smiled with her red lips at the two gentlemen, stretching out her childish white hand to them. Yes, people were right to call her Poppaea, baby, Jildi, but she was really dazzling too, and Joseph no longer knew what he should say to her. She said, "Please be seated," and when the actor sat down, Joseph sat down too, and a short silence followed. The Empress's hair was really amber yellow, as the Emperor had called it in his verses, but the eyelashes and eyebrows over her green eyes were dark. Joseph thought feverishly, "She is quite different from her busts. She is a child, but a child who can have one executed at a moment's notice. What could one say to a child like that? Besides, she was supposed to be terribly clever." The Empress gazed at him, without concealment or embarrassment. A light perspiration broke out on him, and he tried his utmost to maintain a humble and obsequious expression. Her mouth twitched almost imperceptibly, and then she looked no longer childish, but an experienced and somewhat ironical woman. "You are fresh from Judea?" she asked Joseph. She spoke in Greek. Her voice was a little hard and unexpectedly deep. "Tell me," she said, "what do people think in Jerusalem about the Armenian question?" It was a completely unexpected inquiry. For even if the key of Roman Oriental politics lay in Armenia, Joseph had considered his native country far too important to be considered only in relation to a land so barbarous as Armenia, and in actual fact, people in Jerusalem did not think of Armenia at all, or at least he himself never thought of it, and so he could find nothing to say in reply to the question. "The Jews in Armenia are quite well off," he said a little doltishly after a long silence. "Really?" said the Empress, and now she smiled broadly, openly amused. She asked other questions of the same nature. She had her jests at the expense of the young man with the long ardent eyes, who obviously had no idea what game was being played with his country. "Thank you," she said at last, after Joseph had brought out a verbose sentence concerning the strategical position on the Parthian frontier. "Now I am considerably better informed." She smiled appreciatively across at Demetrius Libanus. Who was this comical specimen from the Orient that he had brought to her? "I actually believe," she exclaimed to the actor in surprised appreciation, "that he's interesting himself for his three innocent men out of pure goodness of heart." And she turned to Joseph with great politeness and amiability. "Please tell me all about your protégés." She sat comfortably in her chair. Her throat was smooth and white. Her arms and legs gleamed through the thin silk of her severe dress. Joseph drew out his memorandum, but when he began to read in Greek, she said at once, "But what are you thinking of? Read it in Aramaic." "Yes, but then will you understand it all?" Joseph asked somewhat fatuously. "And who told you that I wanted to understand it all?" replied the Empress. Joseph shrugged his shoulders, more in defiance than in pique. Then he read on in the Aramaic in which he had originally drawn up his speech, and when he came to the quotations from the ancient scriptures, he gave them unabashedly in the Hebrew. But he could not concentrate. He saw that his words were ineffective. He gazed immovably at the Empress, at first humbly, then a little stupidly, then with interest, and finally almost with insolence. He could not tell whether she was listening, far less whether she understood him. When he was finished, she asked immediately, "Do you know Cleo, the wife of my governor in Judea?" He had imagined that such words must sound as if they were engraved in marble, monumental, and now this child was sitting there and saying with a smile, "My governor in Judea," and it sounded quite natural. One knew that it was true, for Gessius Florius was her governor in Judea. Nevertheless, Joseph resolved not to be impressed. "I don't know the governor's wife," he said, and then boldly, "May I expect an answer to my petition?" "I have taken a note of your petition," said the Empress. How was one to know what that signified? The actor thought it was high time to intervene. "Dr. Joseph hasn't much leisure for social matters," he said in defense of his protégé. "His vocation is literature." "Oh," said Poppaea, and she became quite serious and thoughtful. "Hebrew literature. I don't know much about it. What I do know is beautiful, but very difficult." Joseph gathered himself together for a supreme effort. He must succeed in breathing some warmth into this woman who sat there so smilingly and ironically. He said that it was his dearest ambition to open up the great literature of the Jews to the Roman people. "You bring back pearls and spices and gold and curious animals from the East," he said, "but you leave its best treasures, its books, lying where they are." Poppaea asked how he thought of opening up the Jewish literature to the Romans. "Open up a little of it to me," she said, gazing at him intently with her green eyes. Joseph closed his eyes, as people did at home in Judea when they recited stories, and began. He took the first theme that occurred to him, and told of Solomon, a king in Israel, told of his wisdom, his power, his palaces, his temple, his wives, and his idolatry, and how the Queen of Sheba had visited him, and how wisely he had decided the quarrel of two women over a child, and how he had written two very profound books, one about wisdom, entitled The Preacher, and one about love, called The Song of Songs. Joseph tried to render a few verses from The Song of Songs in a mixture of Greek and Aramaic. It was not easy. Now he no longer kept his eyes closed, nor did he translate merely with his lips, but tried to make clear the meaning of those burning verses with gestures, with his whole body. The Empress slid down off her chair. Her arms rested upon it. Her lips were slightly parted. "A beautiful poem," she said when Joseph paused, exhausted by the effort. She turned to the actor. "Your friend is a good young man," said she. Demetrius Libanus, who felt himself pushed a little into the background, employed the opportunity to assert himself again. The treasury of Jewish literature was inexhaustible, he remarked. He himself often had recourse to it when he felt he was becoming stale. "You were splendidly vulgar, Demetrius," said the Empress appreciatively, as the slave Isidore. "I laughed until I was sore." Demetrius Libanus made a wry face. The Empress must have known quite well that what she said, coming from her in particular, was very mortifying to him. This impudent young dolt from Jerusalem hadn't brought him much luck. The audience had miscarried. He should have never arranged it. "Besides, you're still due me an answer, Demetrius," the Empress continued. "You're always talking of a great revolutionary idea that you have in your head. Come out with this idea, won't you? To be quite frank, I hardly believe in it by this time." The actor sat, gloomy and irritated, in his chair. "I have no need to keep back my idea any longer," he said at last truculently. "It's on all fours with what we've been talking about all this time." He made a short dramatic pause, then added casually, "I want to play the Jew Apella." Joseph looked at the other in dismay. The Jew Apella was the caricature of the Jews fashioned by malicious popular Roman fancy, a repellent figure, superstitious, ill-smelling, scurrilous, and disgusting. The great poet Horace had introduced him into literature half a century before, and now Demetrius Libanus wanted... Joseph was horrified. But the behavior of the Empress alarmed him even more. Her pale face was slightly flushed. The variety of expression of which her face was capable filled him both with admiration and fear. The actor savored the effect of his words. "On our stage," he explained, "actors have presented Greeks and Romans, Egyptians and barbarians, but the Jews have not been presented yet." "Yes," said the Empress softly, with excitement. "It's a splendid, a dangerous idea." All three sat for a while in thoughtful silence. "Too dangerous of an idea altogether. said the actor at last sadly, already regretting his words. "I fear I won't be able to carry it out. I shouldn't have divulged it at all. It would be splendid all the same, to play the Jew Apella, not the silly fool the people make him out to be, but the real Apella, in his tragedy and his comedy, with his feasts and his invisible god. I'm probably the only man in the world who could do it. It would be marvelous, but it's too dangerous. Your Majesty understands us Jews, but how few other people do in Rome. The audience will only laugh, and the best that I have to give will be turned to ridicule. It would be a bad business for all us Jews." And after a pause he concluded, "And then I myself might be punished by my invisible god." Joseph sat as if turned to stone. These were wild and equivocal matters that he had blundered into. He himself felt how immense might be the effect of such a dramatic presentation. His quick imagination pictured the actor Demetrius Libanus standing on the stage and pouring all his uncanny life into the figure of the Jew Apella, dancing, leaping, praying, talking with the thousand tongues of his eloquent body. The whole world knew how arbitrary were the moods of the Roman public. Nobody could foresee what the after-effects of such a performance might be, effects which might spread as far as the Parthian border. The Empress had risen. She lifted her hands to the back of her head, her sleeves slipping down, and walked up and down the room, the train of her stola trailing after her. The two men had jumped up when the Empress rose. Be silent, she said to the actor. She was on fire with enthusiasm. "Don't be a coward, now that you have got hold for once of a good idea." She paused beside the actor and almost tenderly laid her hand on his shoulder. "The Roman theater is boring," she lamented. "It's either coarse or obvious or anchored to the old, withered, dry-as-dust tradition. Play the Jew Apella, for my sake, dear Demetrius." She added, turning to Joseph, "Believe me, if he were to play the Jew Apella, it would teach you all a great deal." Joseph stood without speaking, in painful uncertainty. His face flushed and became pale again. Should he try to persuade Demetrius? He knew that the actor longed with his whole heart to present himself in the role of a Jew before the eyes of all Rome. Joseph need only say a word to set the ball rolling. Whither it would roll, nobody knew. "You're tiresome," said the Empress crossly. She had sat down again. The two men were still standing. The actor, accustomed to retain control over his body, stood now in an awkward and helpless posture. "Speak to him, speak to them," the Empress kept on urging Joseph. "God is in Italy now," said Joseph. The actor glanced up. One could see that the phrase had struck him and blown away a whole load of scruples. The Empress, too, was struck by the phrase. "Excellently put," she said, clapping her hands. "You're a clever young man," she said, and she took a note of Joseph's name. Joseph was filled with gratified embarrassment. He did not know how these words had come to his tongue. Had he really invented the phrase himself? Had he said it before some time? In any case, it was the right phrase, and had come at the right moment. And it was quite immaterial whether he himself had invented it or somebody else. The important thing was to say the right thing at the right moment. The phrase, "God is in Italy now," had only come to life now that it had produced such a great effect. But had it really produced such a great effect? The actor still stood irresolute, or at least pretended that he was still irresolute. "Say yes, Demetrius," said the Empress. "If you manage to bring him to the point," she turned to Joseph, "then your three innocent men will get their freedom." Joseph's eyes glittered. He bent down gently, raised the Empress's white hand from the arm of the chair where it was lying, and imprinted a long kiss upon it. "When will you play the Jew Apella?" the Empress asked the actor. "I have made no promise," Demetrius replied, quickly and apprehensively. "Give him a written pledge for our three men," Joseph said in a wheedling voice. The Empress smiled appreciatively over the him and the our. She summoned a secretary. "If the actor Demetrius Libanus," she dictated, "plays the Jew Apella, then I guarantee that the 3 Jewish laborers in the brickworks at Tibur shall be set free." She asked for the tablet and signed her initial P at the bottom and handed it to Joseph. Then she gazed at him with her clear green ironical eyes, and he returned her glance humbly, but so urgently and long that slowly the mockery vanished from her eyes and their clearness was troubled.